It is the return of 360 Fanatic Unleashed. On this episode, I will be going back to 1992 to talk about WCW SuperBrawl II, featuring Sting versus Lex Luger for the WCW World Championship. That's all right now, so it is now time to get unleashed. And welcome back to a brand new episode of 360 Fanatic Unleashed. I am your host, Lance Brock. As always, it's been a little while since it's been a new episode of Fanatic Unleashed. And I always say this every single time, but I hope to be having more episodes up more often, talking about past events, maybe a wrestler profile or something, like a special episode about one wrestler, or just a certain pro wrestling topic that I want to talk about for a little while. And let's start off with this new episode. And as I mentioned on this episode, I am going back to February 29th, 1992, a leap year. That year, obviously. And talk about WCW SuperBrawl II. Live on pay-per-view from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the hosts on the show are Tony Schiavone and Eric Bischoff. The commentators on the show are Jim Ross and Jesse the Body Ventura. And this is also the first appearance in WCW of Jesse Ventura. Interviewer is Missy Hyatt. The ring announcer for the show, Gary Michael Capetta. And the referees, Randy Pee Wee Anderson and Nick Patrick. There is a dark match before the pay-per-view, and we see Big Josh defeat Diamond Dallas Page early on in his career. 7 minutes, 36 seconds. And to open up the main pay-per-view card, it is Flying Brian Pillman defeating Jushin Thunder Liger to win the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship at 17 minutes. These two had a lot of great matches in WCW. At the time, I was a big fan of Flying Brian Pillman. This young, high-flying babyface, and Jushin Thunder Liger, which WCW had a working relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling at the time. And back then, 1992, it definitely was not as easy to follow New Japan or any of the other international promotions, whether it's Japan or Mexico. Mostly the way I used to be able to follow it was in the magazines, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and all the other ones. Used to read about what's going on in Japan and Mexico. And then when WCW started working with New Japan and Jushin Thunder Liger and guys like Yuji Nagata, the Great Muta, other ones started coming over and working matches here in the U.S. for WCW and got to see them. I always was a fan of that, especially Jushin Thunder Liger, and these two would go on and have the very first match on WCW Monday Nitro from the Mall of America. I'm sure everybody remembers that one. Next up, we have Marcus Alexander Bagwell defeating Terry Taylor, 7 minutes 38 seconds. This, of course, is before he was Buff Bagwell, when he was kind of like a young white meat baby face coming up in the business. And this might have even been before he started like teaming with like a bunch of guys. Too Cold Scorpio, The Patriot, and now he's doing pretty good for himself. He's gotten better, had some issues. I recommend a couple weeks or so ago on 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. Eric and Conrad had a pretty good interview with Buff Bagwell discussing his career and what's going on in his life now, getting clean off drugs and getting healthier. So I definitely recommend checking that out. It is a good listen. 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. So if you can check that out. Also, Ron Simmons defeated Cactus Jack, 6 minutes 34 seconds. Surprise, kind of a short match there. Two great wrestlers, two who would definitely go on to be legends in this business. Ron Simmons, of course, WCW World Champion and a WWE Hall of Famer as one half of the APA. And Cactus Jack, legendary Mick Foley, also WWE Hall of Famer. Also, former world champion, not WCW, but WWF. These two were just great performers. Even back then, they put on a great show. And next up, maybe not such a great performer, but we have Van Hammer and the Z-Man, Tom Zank, teaming up. And they defeat Richard Morton and Vinny Vegas. 12 minutes, 1 second. I'm sure everybody listening right now that is around my age remembers Van Hammer in WCW. Kind of like this metal guitar artist. And Tom Zink, the Z-Man, who I thought was kind of underrated, actually. At the time, when I was a kid, I was a fan of the Z-Man. I even mentioned him on today's episode of Good Morning Wrestling Fans, when I was talking about some pro wrestling action figures that I had when I was a kid. He was one of them. I had the Bendham one, I believe. He has unfortunately passed away. And their opponents, Richard Morton, of course, who is better known as Ricky Morton, one half of the legendary tag team, the Rock and Roll Express, and a wrestler at that time known as Vinny Vegas. Most people know him as, let's see, there's a few. Oz, you might know him as. You might know him as Big Daddy Cool Diesel. And you might even know him as Super Shredder. But I'm sure most people now mainly know him as Kevin Nash. And I remember seeing him as like this cool, cocky guy. I kind of liked him, even though he was a heel at the time. And I remember he was at one of the WCW house shows I went to at the time at Cobo Hall. And even though he was a heel, I still was kind of a fan of him. In our next match on SuperBrawl II, we have, this is a real good one, Barry Windham and the Natural Dustin Rhodes defeating the team of Stunning Steve Austin and Larry Zbyszko with Medusa in their corner at 18 minutes 23 seconds when Barry Windham pinned Larry Zbyszko. Larry Zbyszko was already a veteran at this time, and then Barry Windham has been around too, I believe, at that time, but you got two younger guys, the Natural Dustin Rhodes and Stunning Steve Austin. Of course, Dustin Rhodes would go on to be Goldust, maybe what he's most famous for, even though I would say, and I'm not saying that I don't like the character Goldust, but I have always been a fan of Dustin when he's just himself, Dustin Rhodes. But probably more of the casual wrestling fans probably know him more as Goldust. And he would also go on to have a run in TNA, definitely not as well known and memorable as Goldust, but he was Black Rain, and now currently in 2023 in AEW, which he has said this is going to be his last year in pro wrestling, as a wrestler anyway. I don't know if maybe he plans on it or anything, but I think he would definitely make a good agent, producer, coach, whichever you want to call it, backstage. I know he does help out with training some of the women in AEW today, but definitely 4 legends in the business in this tag team match. And Stunning Steve Austin. I wonder what he ever went on to do in the pro wrestling business. Oh, that's right. There's this one character you may have heard of in wrestling, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Maybe. You might have heard of him. And Next up, Arn Anderson and beautiful Bobby Eaton defeat the Steiner brothers, Rick and Scott, via disqualification to retain their WCW World Tag Team Championships. 20 minutes, 6 seconds. Definitely remember this match. At the time, I was a big Steiner Brothers fan. Loved Rick and Scott back then. And Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton, I definitely disliked them, which they were the heels, so was supposed to. But now I'm older and I appreciate their work in the ring, and especially Arn Anderson, his work on the microphone and the promos. I know this was after a lot of his famous ones with the Four Horsemen, but still, he is still good teaming with Bobby Eaton here. And the Steiner brothers, great tag team wrestling at that time. Next, we have a match for the WCW United States Championship. Ravishing Rick Rude defeated Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Unfortunately, Rick Rude has passed away quite a while ago. And great wrestler, great worker, but again, he is one, when I was a kid, I hated that cocky heel attitude and everything, just hated him, of course, and I loved Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, one of my all-time favorites. Was a big fan. So at this time, I was hoping that Steamboat would have defeated Rick Rude, but unfortunately, that did not happen. So, still United States Champion, Rick Rude. And now it is time for our main event of WCW SuperBrawl II. And another one of my all-time favorite wrestlers, Sting, challenging for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship against the Total Package, Lex Luger, with Harley Race in his corner. This is the time when Lex Luger was a heel. I want to say, like, the tagline for the pay-per-view was something like best friends, now bitter enemies. They collided in the or bitter rivals, I should say. I got just a second. The official tagline was best friends, now bitter rivals, brawl for it all. And Sting defeats Luger for the WCW World Championship. 13 minutes, 2 seconds. I was definitely a little Stinger at the time. Huge fan of Sting. I have talked about that many times on different podcasts. Sting goes for a diving crossbody to Luger, but then when outside the ring, Harley Race was there, tried to interfere, but Sting attacked him and then delivered a crossbody to Luger in the ring to win the match and the championship. New WCW World Champion Sting. And just a little bit of info, this was Lex Luger's final appearance in WCW. He would leave, but he could not actually wrestle anywhere else, so he could not go to WWF just yet. But what they did was, Vince McMahon signed him to the World Bodybuilding Federation. If anybody remembers, that was Vince McMahon's attempt to get into the bodybuilding business, forming that promotion. They even had a pay-per-view, and a little while back, post-wrestling, I talk about quite a bit. Big fan of theirs. John Pollock and Wade Ting did a watch-along of that WBF pay-per-view, if you're interested in checking that out. But then in 1993, he would go to the WWF, debut as a narcissist, and then he would return in WCW on the debut episode of Monday Nitro, September 4th, 1995. So that was a really good main event, or at least I thought it was anyway. Sting and Lex Luger. I was a fan of both. Well, Luger, when he was a babyface anyway, I was a fan. And Sting, I've always been a fan. One of my favorites, and always will be, of all time. So that was SuperBrawl II, and in my opinion, this was a WCW pay-per-view that I always enjoyed. Don't know about anybody else, but you can go back and watch it on Peacock if you're here in the United States, or WWE Network anywhere else. I recommend watching it. Good watch, and let me know what you think of it here in the comments on Spreaker or wherever you're listening to this podcast at, or email 360wrestlingpodcasts@gmail.com. And that's all for this episode of 360 Fanatic Unleashed. I know I always say this, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, but I definitely hope to start having new episodes again on a regular basis, whether talking about a past event or a certain wrestler from the past, or even one who's a current wrestler now, maybe, or a certain topic of pro wrestling. And if you have any suggestions of an episode of Fanatic Unleashed you want me to do, you can either leave it in the comment section wherever you are listening, or email, once again, 360wrestlingpodcasts@gmail.com. And stay tuned for more episodes of 360 Wrestling Fanatic. And tomorrow morning for Good Morning Wrestling fans. But until next time, I am Lance, and I am a wrestling fanatic.